Terrible Wi-Fi as usual. Anyway, hey everyone. Put a little bit of that. Anyways, let's see if this works. Hopefully it is. We can get started. All right, welcome, sir. Nice to see you here. I don't know what that means. Hopefully, something cool. Oh man. Oh man. Long live Emperor Urslav. Seamus, welcome. Nice to see you here. Ollie said he's going to join, so hopefully he joins soon. Also, yo, could you tell the people in the general news chat to join the stream? That would be helpful. So you guys can hear me, right? Kind of sucks, like this thing is just, well, whatever. Your name is Cab Calloway. Okay, cool. Interesting. Where are you from, by the way? Okay, wait. But, World Builder, do not invite Orthodox trolls again, please. Like, I'm being serious. I don't want them. From Utah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay. You're okay, Cataphractos. If you act up, though, we might be banning you, bro, so, behave. Keep the Protestant. That should be a thing, yeah. Should have that, the Keep the Protestant movement. Samo Kurbanov. Yeah, somehow I don't believe that. Ottoman Empire was Christian. Hey man, it's almost like we made an entire series on that with a certain someone. I wonder who that is. Alright, folks, we're closing Discord. Hopefully all enjoys. Alright. Kral Isai Yasha. Kral Isai Yasha. Yo, that was so peak. That was one of our best alt hits, if I say so myself. Alright. Getting started, folks. Boom. So, once again, most of you already know the drill, but for anyone new who hasn't already, essentially this is going to be different from my regular videos. This is going to be in a more, well, it is in a slideshow format, which means that, yeah, I am basically still reading the script, but every once in a while I add in random fun facts. There are images, some jokes. This presentation is meant to be mostly neutral, but it is biased still. That will come up when we discuss Mormonism, so to any Mormons here, I'm sorry, but that's just the reality of it. And yeah, all the maps are made by myself, and so you get to see these maps that I made over time documenting the spread of Christianity. Thank you very much, and let's get started. So, in case you don't know, by the way, last time we ended in 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and we are now going to cover the last 210 years of Christian history, which is pretty exciting, so let's get started. So let's first check in at the state of Protestantism in the 19th century. So Protestantism was not in good shape at the start of the 19th century, being a regional religion based in northwestern Europe with some settlers as well in North America. And although it enjoyed state support, the state essentially ran Protestant churches down to the smallest details. Also, most of these churches were influenced by Enlightenment rationalism, leading many of them to essentially teach deism instead of Christianity. Historical, scientific, and archaeological breakthroughs led many to begin questioning the Bible's authority. And as well, the Industrial Revolution was kind of going on, and that was not making things better because many workers who moved to the cities stopped going to church, and a gap soon emerged between those who attended church and those who did not. So then we get the rise of Romanticism. Of course, we have the most famous romantic painting, this one here, by Caspar David Friedrich. And just as it seemed that Protestantism was going to fade into irrelevance, it would face its greatest growth actually during the 19th century. What happened is that many Protestants got tired of the Enlightenment rationalism, especially after the catastrophe of the French Revolution, and this led to a reaction known as Romanticism. Now, Romanticism actually has nothing to do with love letters and gooey feelings, but was an intellectual movement that emphasized the importance of subjectivity, imagination, and appreciation of nature. And for that reason, I actually consider myself a bit of a romantic. Now, it emerged as a result of the changes brought about by the Industrial and the French Revolutions. Now, Romantics were individualistic, arguing that passion and intuition were crucial to understanding the world, and that beauty was something that was meant to invoke an emotional response. Now, the turn away from rationalism led to a greater emphasis on historic creeds, such as the Augsburg Confession from 1555, I believe, the Heidelberg Confession later that century, and the Westminster Confession. And Protestants moved away from formality and ritual to a focus on a personal relationship with Jesus. This led to a large growth in social activities such as education and a fight against slavery, alcoholism, and poverty. And for the first time, Protestants really began focusing on missionary work, which would allow for their global spread in the next century. Finally, there was also growth in intellectualism led by theologians such as Friedrich Schleiermacher, Soren Kierkegaard, Albrecht Ritschl, and Adolf von Harnack. Now, as part of this Protestant comeback, we saw the Second Great Awakening, and it was influenced by Romanticism, and it was therefore characterized by enthusiasm, emotion, and an appeal to the supernatural. It was also characterized by post-millennialism, the belief that Jews would return after a literal millennium, so Christians had to prepare the world for his return. And for those of you who know that I'm recording this today on the 24th of September, many of you will know that there was this big thing about how Jesus would come back yesterday. Newsflash, he didn't. He might come back today. Some people are saying that too, but I doubt it. Now, the Second Great Awakening began with a series of revivals in the 1820s in Western New York, which would lead to the flourishing of nonconformist and evangelical churches. This movement soon spread to the American frontier, where evangelical denominations, especially Methodist and Baptist churches, sent missionary preachers to create and grow churches. Now, they became known for their large outdoor gatherings known as camp meetings, which originated from holy fairs, which were brought to them to the U.S. from Northern Irish and Scottish Presbyterians. Most of these people then settled in the Appalachian Mountains around the War of Independence. Now, Methodist and Baptist revivals were greatly helped by their belief in man's spiritual equality before God, which helped them to recruit from all classes and races, especially slaves and ordinary people. The first revival is considered to be the revival of 1800 in Kentucky, which began as an informal Presbyterian camp meeting. A larger one happened the next year, led by Presbyterian minister Barton W. Stone, but he was soon joined by Baptist and Methodist preachers. And this is Barton Stone over here. Now, although Presbyterians and Methodists worked together to lead these meetings, as they became more expressive, the Presbyterians kind of got freaked out. They're not known for being very emotional, and they kind of stepped back from the whole Second Great Awakening movement. Meanwhile, the Methodist circuit riders and the Baptist preachers were very successful in increasing church membership, and the Presbyterians saw some moderate growth as well. But for every 2 male converts, there were about 3 female converts, and women became quite involved in the spread of the Second Great Awakening. Now, another marginalized group in the U.S., the African Americans, gained prominence during this time. Harry Hosier, the driver of Methodist preacher Francis Asbury, was an illiterate freed slave who was able to memorize large passages of the Bible, and was so successful he even began preaching to European American audiences in 1784. But this is America after all, and of course racism had to come in and ruin everything. Now, even though he was considered the best preacher in America by founding father Benjamin Rush, no less, and by the first Methodist bishop Thomas Coke, he happened to have the wrong skin color, and so he was not allowed to vote in church meetings or become a pastor, because after all, we know, the Bible says black people are not allowed in church or something. Now, another person attending the meetings was Richard Allen, who was ordained in 1799, but he left the Methodist Church because of racism, and he founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, there were also African American Baptist churches that were created in the southern United States. This new religious freedom led many slaves to demand actual freedom instead of just spiritual freedom, which led many European Americans to try to suppress these black churches, and soon a law was passed requiring that there would be at least one white person in every single black church. Now, many of the new converts after the Second Great Awakening were told to not just repent of personal sin, but also work towards the moral perfection of society and eradicate all sin. In this spirit, the Congregationalists set up missionary societies to evangelize the northern part of the American frontier. The American Bible Society was set up in 1816 with a strong emphasis on Christian education. Many of the volunteers in the society were women, and they often sponsored many of these organizations. This led to more support for the abolitionist and temperance movements, which sought to end slavery and alcoholism respectively. They also tried to take care for prisoners, the handicapped, and the mentally ill. Meanwhile, we have this guy, Frederick William III, who was ruling Prussia, and he had one goal, which was to unite the Protestant churches in his domain and impose one standardized liturgy, one organization, and one architectural style. Now, this led to the creation of the Church of the Prussian Union, when the Lutheran and Calvinist churches were united into one evangelical church in 1817, with the Prussian government having full authority. It's a very German approach to politics, one could say, and religion. However, many Lutherans were unhappy with this and split, leading to the Old Lutheran movement consisting of free churches. Facing persecution, many of their members would move abroad to Australia and the United States until 1845, when they were offered amnesty. And so now we get to look at Christianity in 1820, and we'll notice there is a newcomer on this map. So once again, let's go over the different denominations. Of course, the Nestorians still out here, chilling in Assyria, nothing's changed. The Oriental Orthodox, same, mostly concentrated in Armenia and Ethiopia, with a few in Egypt and Nubia. The Eastern Orthodox, of course, are going strong in the Balkans, as well as all throughout the Russian Empire, all the way here to Siberia. The Hussites, very few, but still some left in the Czech Republic. The Reformed are a little scattered everywhere. We have some southern France, Switzerland, eastern Hungary, parts of Poland, Scotland, scattered across England, Dutch colonies in, well, no longer Dutch colonies in South Africa, but, Dutch influence areas in the Moluccas, South Africa, and Guyana, as well as the Puritans here in New England. We have the Anglicans, again, in parts of England and Wales and northern Canada. you have the Lutherans, who are, again, mostly in Scandinavia and northern Germany and Estonia and Latvia, as they have always been. Of course, the Catholic Church throughout large parts of southern and eastern Europe. You had some Catholic Germans settled here in Russia, the Philippines. Most of South America is Catholic, as well as Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean, and of course some areas such as Quebec and parts of northern Canada. We can see the Orthodox even are here in Alaska and some in California because of the Russian settlement there. Of course, the nonconformists are pretty much across the northern United States and large parts of Canada, but we'll notice there is a new denomination, and that is the Baptists. And that's because during the Second Great Awakening, large parts of the American South converted to the Baptist faith, and therefore, basically, the Baptists are now the majority here in the southern United States. Anyways, let's check in on the chat, see how things are going right now. Welcome, Ollie. Nice to see you here. Long live Romanticism. Yes, Jesus was African American. Oh, impersonate Trump. Jesus was an African American. African American. Yo, welcome, Uncle Sam. We just mentioned the Southern Baptists, actually. I don't know if you saw that. Anyway, let's keep going. So in 1821, the Greek War of Independence began against the Ottoman Sultanate, so the Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory V, issued statements condemning the Greek fighters, hoping that this would spare the Greek community of Constantinople from violence. But he was wrong. His performance did not convince the Sultan, who had him hanged on Easter from the main gate of his residence, and after this, the Greeks of the city were massacred. Some bishops in Cyprus tried to support the rebellion, but they also ended up being hanged too. Now, despite this shocking violence, Greece actually successfully gained independence and decided to take control of its own Orthodox Church in 1833 instead of relying on Constantinople, which was under Ottoman rule. Now, this was eventually recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1850, and in 1831 the Serbian Orthodox Church also gained autonomy. And here are the Greeks after winning their independence. Now, one movement that did arise from the Second Great Awakening was the Restoration Movement, which tried to unite all Christians in a church based on the New Testament. They were against creeds and church traditions, which they saw as divisive and believed that only the Bible should be used. One early leader in this movement was James O'Kelly, who was dissatisfied with the Methodist bishops, so he created his own Republican Methodist Church in 1792. Meanwhile, our boy Barton Stone in 1804 left the Presbyterian Church and wanted to be part of the broader Christian church because he emphasized his freedom to do so. His followers worked to restore the church and lifestyle of the New Testament while rejecting tradition. Now, Stone believed that Jesus was about to return, and many of his followers rejected war, government participation, greed, militarism, violence, and slavery. Now, this is Thomas Campbell. So he was another former Presbyterian minister who in 1809 organized the Christian Association of Washington, a congregationally governed church. His approach was a combination of Enlightenment and Puritan ideals. From the Enlightenment, he got the idea that Christians could unite over a series of essentials that are reasonable, and a rational faith based on the Bible that could be discovered. But unlike Stone, he was more optimistic in the potential for human progress and believed that Christians could unite to transform the world and usher in the millennium and finally allow Jesus to return. Now, although Stone and Campbell's movements had some differences, they both agreed that restoring original Christianity would hasten Jesus' return and would allow for Christian freedom. Now, they also both believed that this could unite Christianity, and while this did happen, they managed to unite their own movements in 1832. Their new church became known as the Disciples of Christ, but it soon became divided when a new member joined that year, an English immigrant named John Thomas. Now, he insisted that only those baptized by other disciples of Christ could be seen as true Christians, so everyone who came in had to be baptized again. He continued to have supporters within the church, but got rebaptized in 1846, and in 1864 called his followers the Christadelphians, who then became their own separate denomination. And now, of course, we get to the most famous person in the Restoration and Restorationist movement, Joseph Smith. Now, this would become probably the most insane Christian movement in centuries. As the Second Great Awakening led to local revivals across Western New York, there was a lack of clergy, which led to many new religious movements, ideas, and experiments. In 1820, one boy who attended these revivals, named Joseph Smith, had a vision of Jesus, who told him his sins were forgiven. He then had many visions in which he saw angels and a prophet warrior called Moroni, who showed him where to find a set of golden plates. These contained ancient writings that Moroni had sealed in a stone box before his death, and had an account of the various nations that once lived in America and how Jesus had brought them there. And this is Joseph Smith having his vision. I believe he was 14 at the time. Now, somehow his wife began writing down these idiotic ideas, and then Joseph was able to translate the golden plates through the help of God and some magical rocks. This book was eventually published as the Book of Mormon in 1830. Now, this wasn't just a fictional history of the Native Americans, but also a warning against pride and wealth and against secret societies who carry out evil. Now, the fact that Smith himself was a member of the Freemason secret society, which used secret symbols and oaths, seemed to matter little because the rules did not apply to him. Now, the climax of the book was when Jesus visited the ancient Americans, during which he taught them the importance of his death and resurrection. Now, in 1829, John the Baptist supposedly showed up to Joseph Smith and appointed him as the first legitimate priest, since all the other ones followed a corrupted Christianity. Now, this marked the official beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Joseph Smith soon began baptizing many followers, inspired not by John the Baptist, but by some random guy called Alma the Elder. Now, at the end of the year, Smith received a revelation about the new church and how it should be organized, and it called for priests and teachers to meet regularly for communion. And then on the 6th of April, 1830, the church was legally established with 50 followers. They had visions, prophecies, shouted and spoke in tongues. And Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were then appointed as the apostles. So here's John the Baptist anointing these two, supposedly again. Now, this new church doubled in size after Sidney Rigdon, a former disciple of Christ's minister, converted and brought his church into the Mormon church. He became a leader of the movement, and it soon established its headquarters in Ohio in 1831. Now, in this new church, there were many charismatic experiences, and many had visions of God or communicated with him through magical stones, because, I don't know, apparently this is like a thing, recurring theme in Mormonism. However, some of these visions began contradicting Smith's own visions, so he prayed about it, and suddenly conveniently realized that the only one who could receive new doctrines and commandments was him. So anyways, in 1836, the first Mormon temple was opened in Kirtland, Ohio, and soon new ideas about drinking and food were introduced. Joseph Smith also acquired scrolls from Egypt, which contained the writings of Abraham and Joseph, even though no one else had found these. And in case you thought he was done, after he was caught cheating on his wife, he then realized that God allowed him to practice polygamy. So Joseph Smith had a new revelation where he told his followers to prepare for the return of Jesus, who would land in Independence, Missouri, because of course that's the most American way ever. Now this led many Mormons to move there in 1831, and so many arrived that the Christians there feared that they would be replaced and lose political power. So in 1833 they formed vigilantes and kicked them out. The Mormons whined and they begged to return, but they weren't able to. So in 1838, Smith decided to move to Missouri himself, where he immediately got into an argument with the other leaders such as Cowdery, who then was excommunicated from the church. He then got a new revelation in which he discovered that everyone now had to tithe, and Mormon militias were then created. This led to Smith's arrest in Liberty, Missouri, and his followers were soon expelled from the state. And so there's Joseph going to prison. Not a fun time. Now, Joseph Smith, just like every other cult leader, he had his time, but, they all have their downfall. So what happened to him? Well, in 1839, the Mormon refugees regrouped in Nauvoo, Illinois, where they built a temple in 1841, and they created independent courts, a university, and their own army called the Nauvoo Legion, which I guess kind of goes hard, if you have to admit that. Now, while here, Smith introduced baptism for the dead, rebaptism, the second anointing, and a new inner council of the church called the Anointed Quorum. He also began openly advocating for polygamy, and he called himself the prophet, the priest, and the king, which, sounds a bit blasphemous. I think that's supposed to be for Jesus, but moving on. Now, the local Protestants felt threatened by their growing power, and Smith was once again thrown in jail, where he only had 2 guards. He was then attacked by a mob in there and died like a true martyr by shooting as many people as he could before finally being shot himself. And so here is a picture of the killing of Joseph, and I think his brother too was killed too. And that's a more Mormon approach to it over here on the right. So what happened to Mormonism? Well, of course, nobody knew who would lead the church after his death, and so three men were presented. Sidney Rigdon, the president of the High Council, who you remember was the former Disciples of Christ minister, William Marks, and then the leader of the Quorum of the 12, Brigham Young. Now, Rigdon and Young debated, during which Joseph Smith supposedly reincarnated briefly within Brigham Young, who spoke in his voice, and this convinced the Mormons to have him as their new leader. Now, after an argument with Joseph's brother William Smith, as well as more and more conflict with the local Protestants, Brigham Young realized that the Mormons had to leave Nauvoo, and this led to the Mormon Exodus in 1846. Now, the largest group followed 9 of the 12 apostles to the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and the Mormons have been the majority in Utah ever since. Now, what are some of their beliefs? Well, the Mormons believe in the Bible, but they also believe in the Book of Mormon, the Doctrines and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And although Mormonism originated from Protestantism, it soon diverged because they claimed that they were the only true, original, restored church. Now, they rejected the Trinity, which is always a terrible sign if you want to know about any doctrinal clarity, and instead they embraced the Godhead of God the Father, Jesus Jehovah, and the Holy Spirit. The goal for humanity to them is to reunite with God because humans are God's spirit children. Now, true Christianity to them was only restored when John the Baptist and the apostles Peter, John, and James appeared to Joseph Smith and made him a prophet to guide the church back to its roots. And here is a picture of the Mormon Exodus going over to Utah. Now, if you thought the Mormons were goofy, well, just so you know, they weren't the only ones around at this time. So, who's this guy? Well, this is a guy named William Miller, and he would become the leader of the Adventist movement. Now, they believed that the second coming was right around the corner, and they followed a Baptist preacher, William Miller, who in 1833 began preaching that there were only 10 years left until Jesus would come back. Now, he emphasized teachings anticipating the end of the world and told his followers that they had to prepare for Jesus' return. He got 50 to 100,000 Americans to support his predictions, and they gathered in 1843 to wait for Jesus. Now, again, in case you forgot, Jesus was supposed to come back yesterday, so I'm really not sure, but wait, let's see if he was right, though. Now, well, it turns out Jesus didn't show up, but actually, it was then revealed that the next spring would be the time Jesus would come back. Now, Jesus didn't come back that time, and then he promised everyone that on the 22nd of October, 1844, Jesus would finally show up. And then when Jesus ghosted Miller, most of Miller's followers ended up ghosting him. Now, the failed predictions led to what was known as the Great Disappointment. Now, despite this obvious false prophecy, some clowns still followed Miller, and in 1845, the Albany Conference was held to determine the future of the movement. However, the delegates disagreed on a lot of theological beliefs and soon split into 4 separate churches. They debated about whether the dead would be conscious or not, whether the inhabitants of hell would be tortured forever or annihilated, whether the wicked are resurrected after the millennium, and what day the Sabbath should be celebrated on. And in 1863, the largest group was formed as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which believed that the Sabbath was on Saturday. So let's look at Protestantism meanwhile. Well, Protestantism saw major expansion during the 1820s when the first settlements of the British in New Zealand happened, and there was expansion across the eastern Australian coast and then later in Western Australia and in 1830. And this further allowed the spread of Anglicanism, which became the dominant form of Christianity there. Now, another denomination that was growing a lot was that of the Baptists, whose Southern American followers expanded past the Mississippi and south into Florida. By 1840, colonization in South Africa, particularly by the British, led to the spread of nonconformist Protestantism in Africa. Meanwhile, in 1846, the US and Mexico went to war, leading to an American victory and the conquest of California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And many Southern Baptists began settling in Texas, which had once been majority Catholic. And therefore, by 1850, most of Australia and New Zealand had been settled, and this made them majority Anglican. Alright, so now let's move over, see what the chat has to say about this. Your ancestors went with Young to Utah. Okay, cool. I mean, obviously you can tell I'm not a fan of Mormonism, but hey, I just had to be honest about it. Hopefully you're not too offended. Yeah, 'cause, Oh, good question. Am I going to talk about Christianity in China and the Taiping Rebellion? Honestly, I should have. But I unfortunately am not talking about the Taiping Rebellion. Oliver Cowdery is my PFP on Discord. Wow, there's a lot of stuff here. Okay. Anyway, Mormon is an American religion. To be fair, Joseph Smith could have made a great sci-fi novel and film. Yeah. Probably could have. Anyways, folks, we are now going to learn a little bit more about what's going on with the Anglicans. So, in 1833, the Irish Church Temporalities Bill was passed by the British government, which merged the dioceses and provinces of the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church of the island. Now, this led some politicians and clergy to fear that the Church of England would lose its privilege as the state Church of England, which led Anglican priest John Keble to criticize these proposals as apostasy in a sermon that he delivered in Oxford in 1833. Now, this led to the formation of the Oxford movement, in which Keble, John Henry Newman, and a guy named Edward Bouverie Pusey published a series called Tracts for the Times, urging the Church of England to return to the earlier undivided church in doctrine and liturgy, and to affirm that its authority came from God and not the state. And this is John Keble, I believe, although I probably should have double-checked before I said that. Now, the Tractarians, as they came to be known, created the branch theory, in which Anglicanism, Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy formed the three branches of the original church. As such, they argued for the inclusion of traditional liturgy because they believed that the church had become too plain. Now, wanting to return Anglicanism more to its Catholic roots, the Tractarians set up the first Anglican religious orders in the 1840s, which had not existed in England since Henry VIII had shut down all the monasteries 3 centuries before. The Oxford movement began influencing the theory and practice of Anglicanism, and its effects led to communion gaining more importance in worship, vestments becoming common, and other Catholic practices being reintroduced into worship. Now, another new movement, this time within Lutheranism, was called Laestadianism. Now, this combined Pietism and Revivalism in the mid-19th century, named after Lars Levi Laestadius, a pastor in Sweden of Sami origin. Now, after meeting a Sami woman named Milla Clementsdotter in 1844, who told her about her spiritual experiences on her journey to becoming a true Christian, Laestadius came to understand what living faith looked like. But Laestadius faced some issues, since many Sami had been forced to convert for paganism, and so were not really focused on Christianity, and many were also suffering from alcoholism. Now, he faced some advantages because he was Sami himself, and he understood their culture, using concepts from Sami paganism to help explain the gospel. He also employed uneducated preachers from the community to help spread the gospel, especially among the reindeer herders. Later on, as with other indigenous peoples, Sweden set up a church-run state boarding school, but since these were manned by Laestadians, it was able to spread their faith among the population. Now, their focus on a strict moral code, especially regarding alcohol consumption, appealed to communities that were devastated by alcoholism, and entire communities became sober almost overnight. And this not only helped the health of the community, but also their reputation abroad. Now, we've talked about Anglicanism, we've talked about Lutheranism, but there was also a new movement within Methodism called the Holiness Movement. So, this was led by Methodist evangelist Phoebe Palmer and her husband Walter. In 1837, she experienced what she claimed to be entire sanctification, a second work of grace in which you are entirely cleansed of sin. Now, it was believed that the Holy Spirit would dwell in you, which was considered the baptism of the Holy Spirit. She began leading Tuesday meetings in 1839 for women, but soon Methodist bishops and clergy began attending. Now, Methodist minister Timothy Merritt founded a journal called The Guide to Christian Perfection, which was the first journal dedicated exclusively to promoting the doctrine of Christian holiness. Now, the holiness movement was spread by missionaries like James Caughey, who went to work in Ontario in the 1840s and 50s, and he brought converts in by the score. Now, he combined restrained emotionalism with a clear call for commitment. Now, most holiness preachers remained in the Methodist Church, but some separated, such as the Wesleyan Methodist Connection, which was founded in 1843 partly because it opposed slavery, whereas most of the church supported it. Also, the holiness movement was not just restricted to Methodists and was soon embraced by other Protestant churches such as the Congregationalists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Anabaptists, and Quakers. But there was also another movement called liberal Christianity, and this was basically the complete opposite, promoted by men such as German Protestant theologian Albrecht Ritschl, pictured here. Now, he believed that faith should be based in history and believed that the New Testament affirmed Jesus' divine mission without regard to miracles or the supernatural. So he rejected the virgin birth and the Trinity, and for him Christianity was basically about being a good person, so doctrines were mere value judgments instead of facts. Now, he saw religion as the triumph of the spirit over humanity's animalistic and sinful nature. Now, these liberal Christians mainly focused on Jesus' humane teachings as a standard for civilization that was superior to superstitious paganism. And most of these people saw Jesus' miracles not as actual facts, but as metaphors for the power of God. Unsurprisingly, liberal Christianity soon ended up undermining the belief in God in general, and this led to the rise of atheism for the first time in history. Now, this affected Protestant Europe first, given that it tended to be richer, more influenced by liberal theology, and the state-run Lutheran churches were often influenced by Enlightenment thinking. By the 1840s, Norway had become the first country in the world to effectively become irreligious, and this started the trend of the spread of atheism. By 1850, most of Estonia, Latvia, and Sweden had also become functionally irreligious, and by 1863, the Nordic countries had basically all become majority irreligious, even though they all remain highly Lutheran, at least in name, to this day. And so now we get to Christianity in 1865. Now again, not too much has really changed in Europe, but of course you can see that Scandinavia now has effectively become irreligious, and while there were of course still Christian communities there, they were no longer the majority like they once were. Meanwhile, we can see South America is basically completely colonized. The Southern Baptists have spread all the way here to Texas and Oklahoma. Most of the interior of North America has now been settled, mainly by nonconformist Protestants and some Catholics, but there were still areas left. Of course, Alaska was Orthodox, being a Russian colony. And we can also see Christianity spreading here in Southern Africa, mainly competing between Reformed and nonconformist forms of Protestantism, but also Catholicism was slowly spreading along the coast, mainly thanks to Portuguese colonization. We can also see that New Zealand and most of Australia now are Anglican. But if you think liberalism is a purely Protestant problem, then you're wrong. And although it started with Protestantism, it began spreading within Western Europe to Catholic countries. In 1863, Ernest Renan, a French Semitic scholar, wrote A Life of Jesus, which described him as a man without equals, but not as God. That same year, Ignaz von Dollinger, a German Catholic priest, invited about 100 theologians to meet in Munich to discuss Catholic theology. He advocated for greater freedom of theology and the adoption of the historical method, which basically meant that they would only look at historically verifiable facts about Jesus instead of his supernatural acts. His friend Charles-René de Montalembert gave 2 speeches at a Catholic Congress in Belgium, insisting that the Church should reconcile itself with civic equality and religious freedom. Now, Pope Pius IX listened, and he issued an encyclical called Quanta Cura, which condemned anti-clerical governments in Europe, which were secularizing education and suppressing religious orders and confiscating their property. Now, in response to the rising influence of modern philosophy, the first ecumenical council in Catholic history since the Council of Trent, which had ended in 1565, was called to clarify Catholic doctrine. Now, to be fair to the Pope, he truly actually meant this council to be ecumenical, aka universal, and he even invited Eastern Orthodox and Protestant clerics, but none of them accepted his invitations. The first session was held in St. Peter's in the Vatican on the 8th of December, 1869. Now, the main controversy was over this new doctrine of papal infallibility, the belief that if the Pope issued any doctrine of faith and morals while speaking as pastor and teacher of the Universal Church from his seat in Rome, then this statement could be deemed as ex cathedra. And what this meant is that if he chose to speak ex cathedra, then it would literally be impossible for him to commit any theological or heretical errors. And so here we have a depiction of the First Vatican Council. So, of course, we now had to answer the question, is the Pope infallible? Well, this is the Pope. Do you think he's infallible? Well, as you can imagine, there was some resistance to this doctrine, especially since the Council attempted to make this belief an official doctrine of the Catholic Church. However, the problem wasn't really with the idea itself, but the timing of the announcement. A small minority of about 10% opposed the idea theologically because it departed from the structure of the early church and feared that it will alienate some Catholics, make union with non-Catholics harder, and cause governments to interfere in church affairs. But on the 18th of July, 1870, a document called Pastor Aeternus was created, which defined that Peter had more authority than the other apostles, that this authority was passed down to all popes, and therefore papal infallibility was indeed a valid doctrine. But just as the Pope got this massive theological win, he would take one of the biggest blows politically. Now, discussion on the rest of the document on the nature of the church was supposed to continue after the bishops returned from their summer vacation. Well, one country that was not taking a break that summer was France. It was being invaded by Prussia, and so the troops that it had held in Rome to defend the Pope were sent back home to defend French soil. Emperor Napoleon III was captured on the 2nd of September, so the newly formed Kingdom of Italy took advantage of the situation to complete their unification, and they captured Rome on the 20th. This ended the existence of the Papal States after over 11 centuries, and a month later Pope Pius adjourned the Second Vatican Council indefinitely, bringing it to a quite anticlimactic end. So what are the results of the First Vatican Council? Well, the dogma of papal infallibility was imposed in some theological circles in the German-speaking world and the Netherlands, most notably by this guy, Ignaz von Dollinger, who was excommunicated in 1871 for refusing to accept the First Vatican Council. A small minority of Catholics formed what was called the Old Catholic Church, which opposed the Roman Catholic Church and began consecrating their own bishops. Eventually, they would join the Anglican Church in 1931 through the Bonn Agreement. Now, others took advantage of the weak position of the Catholic Church to strengthen their own power, with this being seen amongst several European governments of the time, most notably Austria and France. Now, if you think the Pope was getting a break, you're wrong, because now Germany was also going to attack the Pope. Now, Germany had been created in 1871 through the many efforts of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and he would not tolerate any power base outside of Germany. He declared a Kulturkampf, or culture war, against the Catholic Church in 1873 with a lot of support from the liberals. This led many German Catholics to respond by forming their own party, the Center Party. Now, Catholics were nearly a third of the population, but were rarely allowed to hold major positions in the government, and the pulpit law made it a crime to discuss public issues in a way that displeased the government. And so nearly all Catholics rejected these laws. And so here we have a famous cartoon from the time showing Bismarck and the Pope playing a game of chess. But eventually this had to come to an end. Now, Bismarck had underestimated the force of resistance of the Catholic Church, which denounced the new laws and mustered the support of its voters across Germany. This led the Center Party to win a quarter of the seats in the Imperial Diet. Now, Pope Pius's death in 1878 led to the end of the Kulturkampf, the following year when Bismarck broke with the liberals to put his emphasis on tariffs, foreign policy, and attacking socialists. I wonder which other fat white man also cares about those three things. Anyways, negotiations with the new Pope, Leo XIII, who got the bishops returned and the priests released. Now, many laws were toned down or cancelled, but the pulpit law and the laws on education, marriage, and religious disaffiliation remained in place. Now, this strengthened the Center Party, which allied with Bismarck to attack the socialists. But if you think the Catholic Church was taking a break, you're wrong again, because now it was France's turn to go to war. Now, back to France. After its loss to Germany, it became a republic again. The French clergy and bishops were associated with the recently deposed monarchy, and many of its hierarchy was from the nobility. Now, Republicans gained most of their support from the anti-clerical middle class, who saw the alliance of the monarchy and the Catholic Church as a threat to republicanism and the spirit of progress and modernity. Now, the Republicans tend to be supported by Protestants and Jews as well. Many laws were then passed to weaken the Catholic Church, and in 1880 they targeted religious congregations and cut the salaries of priests they disliked. In 1882, meanwhile, new school laws set up a national system of public schools that did not teach religion. Civil marriage became obligatory, divorce was introduced, and chaplains were removed from the army. This led Pope Leo XIII to urge French bishops to not defy the state in 1884 and to rally to the Republic in 1892, but even these acts of goodwill were not enough, and the suspicions remained high. So, let's check the chat, and then we'll check in on the Orthodox Church. So, let's go. Let's see what's being said. Liberal Christianity is retarded. Fortunate that irreligious spread. You don't have to believe in religion to begin. From empirical perspective, it's a good thing. It reflects the rise of evidence-based thinking. I don't know if irreligiosity is actually evidence-based thinking. You're still placing your faith in something. But I won't get into that right now. This isn't the point. Drumstick, welcome to the chat. Oh no, the Orthodox cringe fest. Anyways, I hope you guys are enjoying it. We're getting, of course, as you can tell, right close to the end of the 19th century, and then we'll get to the 20th century soon. All right, so let's look at the Eastern Orthodox Church in the late 19th century. Now, in 1859, this guy, Alexandru Ioan Cuza, became Prince of Moldavia and Wallachia, and 3 years later united the principalities to create Romania. In 1863, he then confiscated monastic property, which was opposed by the Patriarch of Constantinople. This led Cuza to pass legislation proclaiming the complete independence of the Romanian Orthodox Church, which was eventually recognized by Patriarch Joachim IV of Constantinople in 1885. In 1879, the Serbian Orthodox Church similarly gained full independence, while in 1878, the UK bought Cyprus from the Ottomans, allowing the local Eastern Orthodox Church more independence there. Now, after the American Civil War ended in 1865, many in the Holiness movement became nostalgic for the camp meeting revivals of the Second Great Awakening, so the first Holiness camp meeting occurred in New Jersey in 1867, with 10,000 coming. Now, with 25,000 people from across the country, and its Monday services became legendary for their spiritual power. Now, this was so successful that by the 1880s, Holiness was among the most powerful religious movements in the country and began spreading among many non-Methodist churches. However, a small minority of about 100,000 in the movement left Methodism to create their own Holiness churches. Now, the Holiness movement also led to the formation of new denominations entirely. In 1878, Methodist preacher William Booth and his wife founded the Salvation Army, a denomination of soldiers who sought to save the poor and hungry by meeting both their physical and spiritual needs. And so yes, Salvation Army is not just about blankets and sweaters, they are actually a Christian denomination. Meanwhile, in 1881, Daniel Sidney Warner created the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana. Yes, that is the actual name of the church, Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, and had the insane idea, just wait for this, that different races were actually supposed to worship together. And this was so controversial that many of their churches were attacked. In the 1890s, meanwhile, Edwin Harvey and Marmaduke Mendenhall Farson, which has to be one of the most interesting names, founded the Metropolitan Church Association, taught that all possessions were idols and that Christians should live communally. So essentially, Christian communism. Here are some of the big people. This first guy, I think that's Daniel Sidney Warner, if I'm not mistaken. And this is Edwin Booth and his wife, the founders of the Salvation Army. Now, more generally, there was a broader revival movement sweeping across the U.S. known as the Third Great Awakening. The American Protestant mainline churches were quickly growing in numbers, wealth, and education, and they began being centered in the cities. Now, many crusaded for the prohibition on alcohol, and this led to the formation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874, which also advocated against pornography and prostitution and for women's right to vote. Social gospel preachers fought against child labor and the capitalist class running the U.S., and fought for the protection of female laborers and for mandatory elementary education. Now, each denomination supported active missionary societies, and the majority of mainline churches supported the New Republican Party, urging it to endorse prohibition of alcohol and other social causes. Now, the 1880s saw the promotion of muscular Christianity, led by a guy, and I kid you not, his name was Josiah Strong. Now, this became popular among young men in universities and urban YMCAs, as well as denominational youth groups such as the Methodist Epworth League and the Lutheran Walther League. Meanwhile, in 1891, basketball was invented at the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. Professional baseball player Billy Sunday converted as a young man and became the most influential American evangelist of the early 20th century. And this is Josiah Strong, pretty epic guy. Creating muscular Christianity is quite the achievement, if you ask me. Now, we've seen a lot of false prophets over the years, right? Of course, we've just looked at William Miller, we've looked at Joseph Smith, we've seen a lot of people, but Just wait till you hear about this guy, because this guy blows them all out of the water. Now, in 1876, Charles Taze Russell met Adventist preacher Nelson H. Barber. And that's already starting bad. I mean, if it's starting with the Adventists, it's not going well. And he convinced him that Jesus actually came back 2 years before in 1874. But you might ask, how is that even possible? Because Jesus wasn't there. But then he realized Jesus was there. He was just hiding because he was invisible. Now, he wrote a book the next year called 3 Worlds and the Harvest of this World, which taught that the earth would not be burned up when Jesus returned, which, he sort of had to add in there because Jesus was already back, and that all humans would be resurrected and given the choice to obtain eternal perfect life on earth if they were obedient. He also predicted that in 1878, all Christians would be taken up to heaven. And remember, guys, the rapture, it happened yesterday. I know I keep bringing this up during the stream, but I just want to emphasize that, Jesus did come back yesterday. And basically, Jesus would be crowned king of heaven at that point. Now, the fact that none of these predictions happened did not seem to bother him. In fact, in 1881, he doubled down, predicting that the rapture would happen that very year, and after this also failed, he then just decided that the Trinity was a false doctrine. So this is Charles Taze Russell, and despite everything, literally everything he taught being completely disproved, Russell somehow sold almost 20 million copies of his books, and began what was known as the Bible student movement. In 1886, he began writing a 6-volume Bible textbook series called Studies in the Scriptures, which presented his fundamental doctrines. His supporters gathered as autonomous congregations to study his writings, and elders and deacons were elected by the church congregation, but were not allowed to enforce discipline. His Zion's Watchtower Tract Society was spread from the US to the UK, Germany, Australia, and Switzerland in the early 20th century. So now we get to Christianity in 1884. So we can see things have changed a decent amount. Now, of course, in Europe, the map looks roughly the same, so I won't go over that again, but we can see some changes in other parts of the world. We can see the Philippines are now almost completely Catholic. We can see Protestantism spreading over here in the eastern Indonesian islands. You can see the Anglicanism has basically taken over Australia and New Zealand. We can also see that Christianity is slowly spreading in southern Africa. All of all of South America essentially has been colonized at this point, as well as most of North America. You'll notice there are some pagans here still left, and that is because this was the so-called Indian territory in Oklahoma, which was not yet a state. We can see Mormons are now on the map, having settled around here in North America, at least north of Mexico, between the nonconformists across most of the northern US, Alaska, and large parts of Canada, the Baptists over there in the southern US, and of course some Catholics and a couple of Anglicans as well. And the Reformed, they're still holding strong here in New England. But things are about to change a lot, so get ready for that. So what did Christianity look like in the late 19th century? Well, by 1865, the settlement of New Zealand and Siberia was basically completed, and most of the American interior was being settled as well. By now, Mormonism, as I mentioned, was firmly established in Utah, while the U.S. bought Alaska in 1867 and brought in settlers who changed it from a mainly Eastern Orthodox to Protestant territory. 1870, Catholicism and Oriental Orthodoxy were making minor gains in Africa thanks to the Portuguese and Ethiopians, and by 1884, nearly all of North and South America had been settled. But, of course, there is one big continent that's missing, and that is Africa. So let's check in on the chat now, see what's going on here. Saying I believe in God is a public declaration of atheism. What? If reality and God are the same thing, there's no use in distinguishing them. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, I mean, it's weird, but I'm actually agreeing with Ollie here. Like, you can't just say God is beyond all. Like, the problem is basically World Builder is religious, but he has no religion to follow. So he has these weird statements like that. Also, why is no one commenting the Jehovah's Witness? I feel like, or maybe I didn't make it clear. Charles Taze Russell in his false prophecies, that is the origin of the Jehovah's Witness. Appreciate that you're approaching this from a doctrinal, social perspective as well as a geographical. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was always the point, I didn't want to just talk about theology or just talk about kind of just the history too. So you're treating God as subjective belief rather. I mean, of course he is, but okay, to give Ollie credit here, right? Like, if you're an atheist, why would you not treat God as a subjective belief? Like, I feel like that kind of makes sense, right? So, I actually have to side with Ollie on this one. It's weird. Anyways, let's look at Christianity in Africa. So Christianity, as we know, was by no means new to Africa or even sub-Saharan Africa, with an Oriental Orthodox Church dating back to the 4th century in Ethiopia, which I mentioned in the very beginning of this series. Now, Catholicism had been introduced and maintained by the Portuguese since the 15th and 16th centuries, and more recent Protestant settlement since the 17th century by mainly Lutherans, Calvinists, and nonconformists. Now, what these areas all had in common is that they were near the coast and the vast majority of the continent had never been reached by the gospel. Now, one major missionary pioneer was David Livingstone, a member of the London Missionary Society from Scotland, who became one of the most popular British heroes of the late 19th century for being a Protestant missionary martyr, a scientific investigator, an explorer, and an anti-slavery crusader. And this is David Livingstone. Kind of a legend, you know. So, it wasn't that Europeans randomly got interested in conquering Africa in the late 19th century, but there were several reasons that it only happened at that time. For the longest time, malaria had prevented most Europeans from surviving deep in the continent. I think there was something like a 90% death rate, and therefore they had to stay to the coast. But technological advances from the Industrial Revolution led to the invention of steamships, railways, and telegraphs, and quinine was discovered by Europeans as a treatment for malaria. And these changes allowed Europeans to finally be able to penetrate the African heartland. And so this is quinine. It doesn't look that cool, but it really changed everything. So now we have to ask why the scramble for Africa happened. Now, there was an interesting development in Africa, developing in Africa, because it offered the great powers an open market that could lead to a trade surplus. Capital was more profitably invested overseas, where cheap materials, limited competition, and raw materials made greater profit possible. Sheltered markets in Africa would solve the problems of low prices and overproduction that was being caused by shrinking markets. Now, of course, there was also the desire to acquire military and naval bases for strategic and political power. Navies were growing, and new steam-powered ships required coaling stations and ports for maintenance, and defense bases were needed to protect sea routes and communication lines. Now, colonies were also seen as useful bargaining chips, and those with large native populations could be useful as a source of manpower during a war. And I mean, I'm not saying anything, but let's say hypothetically there was a world war a couple of decades later. Maybe a lot of African troops would be helpful. And of course, this was also the age of nationalism, and nations had to get empires because, you know, empires are cool, and it's only if you have an empire that you could be considered a cool country. So the origins of the scramble of Africa began in 1876 when King Leopold II of Belgium organized the International African Association. Between 1869 and 74, he had sent explorer Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo River and make treaties with several African chiefs. He made another expedition between 1874 and 1877, so the French then sent their own explorer, Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza, to also travel along the Congo River, where he founded Brazzaville in 1881 and claimed it on behalf of France. France also snatched Tunisia that year, which caused Italy to ally with Germany against them in 1882 because Italy had always had a little crush on that Tunisia area, you know. Now, that same year, the UK occupied Egypt, which also included Sudan, South Sudan, and parts of neighboring countries. And this was because the Khedive of Egypt had borrowed large sums from British bankers, which he was unable to pay back. Not a good move. But the British were soon enveloped in the recently started Mahdist War, a rebellion in Sudan led by Muhammad Ahmad because he opposed Christians and their attempts to abolish slavery. So this is Henry Morton Stanley, I believe. And the British occupation of Egypt and the French and Belgian attempts to colonize the Congo were the first big moves in what became known as the scramble for Africa. In order to prevent a chaotic race for everyone to basically steal as much African land as they possibly could, Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference to resolve the disputes. Now, while there were other goals such as ending the slave trade and helping missionaries, the main reason was to prevent a new war over colonies. So they all agreed to the rules. So, no country would make a claim in Africa without first notifying the group chat, and no land could be claimed before it was occupied. However, you can imagine that these rules were not always followed, and on several occasions, war was barely avoided. Of course, there's the famous Fashoda incident of 1898. And so here is a map of the European diplomats with a giant map of Africa deciding where they were going to draw some random straight lines that would definitely not cause any problems a couple of decades in the future. And of course, this famous depiction of the British wanting to take over the entire continent of Africa. Quite ambitious for a small island. So the scramble begins. In 1884, Germany began its colonization of Namibia, taking the coast and naming it German Southwest Africa. Belgian Congo expanded south of the Congo River, and Spain began its colonization of the Oro River in what is now Western Sahara. 1885 saw the UK begin its colonization of Bechuanaland, now Botswana, and the next year Germany began colonizing the eastern coast of Tanzania and the Atlantic coast of Cameroon. 1887 saw France colonize Gabon and Congo, while Belgian Congo continued expanding south. Now, to prevent their domination of the Congo region, Portugal then connected its colonies of Angola and Mozambique on the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coast, respectively. But guess who wasn't happy about this? Well, the British, because they were trying to do the opposite thing of building a massive empire from Cairo to Cape Town, going from north to the south of the continent. So, it was a little bit of a problem because they would have to intersect at some point. And in 1889, Italy decided to join this game, and they colonized Eritrea and Somalia during the chaos following the death of Ethiopian Emperor Yohannes IV. So in 1890, the UK and France, of course our two favorite colonizers, were able to reach a diplomatic solution over a colonial dispute that would guarantee freedom of trade for the British while allowing for the French to expand in North Africa. France would recognize British control over Zanzibar, while Britain would recognize French claims on Madagascar. By 1890, the UK had taken most of Botswana, the East African Protectorate, and Somaliland. Meanwhile, Germany had finished taking over Namibia. In 1891, the British continued advancing north, leading to the colonization of Zimbabwe and southern Zambia and Malawi, which cut off the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique. And meanwhile, in 1892, French West Africa was consolidating with colonies from Senegal down the coast to the Ivory Coast. So now, if we look at Africa in the mid-1890s, basically most of southern Africa had been colonized by the British, who controlled all of modern-day South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, the Gambia, and Somaliland. Meanwhile, Portugal had taken full control of Angola and Mozambique, and Germany had taken all of Namibia and southern Tanzania and Cameroon. Meanwhile, Italy had taken most of Somalia and Eritrea, while Belgium had taken most of the DRC by 1885. Now that year, Italy invaded Ethiopia because, after all, right, the Europeans had constantly been winning. There's no way that the Italians could lose, but oh wait, was that they actually did lose to Ethiopia. And this, alongside with the fact that they were the only Oriental Orthodox country, made Ethiopia a very unique state in Africa. And here is the Ethiopians resisting against the Italians. Now, while all this was happening, France was expanding eastwards from its base in Senegal through the Sahel, which formed the southern border of the Sahara Desert, trying to create a colonial empire from the Niger to the Nile rivers, and therefore control all of the trade in the Sahel region. But of course, you know who else was expanding there? Well, the British. Because while the French were going west to east, the British were going south to north, and that meant that they would clash in Sudan, which was technically under Egyptian control, but was really still controlled by the Mahdist rebels. So French force under Jean-Baptiste Marchand arrived at the town of Fashoda in modern South Sudan in 1898, and they were met by British force led by Herbert Kitchener, the commander-in-chief. Now this created a standoff, but eventually France backed down, being surrender cowards and all that. Okay, I shouldn't make those jokes. But anyways, here we have it, the British kind of dominating the French in Fashoda, looking helplessly back at their Anglo map. Okay, whatever. So now let's look at Africa at the turn of the century. And this force led by Kitchener then eventually defeated the Mahdists in 1898, which put Sudan under British control. The British would soon meet their match in the Second Boer War, which broke out the next year against the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. Now these two republics were established by the descendants of Dutch Calvinist colonists, and they fought to defend their land and gold and diamond industries, which the British wanted. Now by 1900, nearly all of Africa was under European control, with the exception of 4 Muslim states: Ottoman Libya, the Dervish state in eastern Ethiopia, the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria, and Morocco. And then there was also Liberia, which had been a former American colony, and Ethiopia, which remained independent after whooping Italy's ass. And so now we get to Christianity in 1899. Basically, the Americas have been fully colonized. Things are basically the same in Europe and Oceania, but we can see now that Christianity is spreading a lot across more southern and central Africa. So in 1902, the British won the Second Boer War, which brought all of South Africa under their control, and they invaded the Sokoto Caliphate, which was conquered in 1903, which led them to totally control Nigeria. By 1905, France had taken over the remaining unclaimed parts of the Sahara and was ready to take over Morocco. Now, this led German Emperor Wilhelm II to visit the country to support its independence, and that created a little bit of a crisis between France and Germany. They had the 1906 Algeciras Conference, in which Germany had no diplomatic support except from Austria and therefore had to back down. But Germany would later send a warship to Morocco in 1911, but this was too much provocation, and the French and Spanish decided to just split up Morocco to prevent the Germans from taking over. Now, of course, we've been talking a lot about politics, but there is a reason I talked about Africa this entire time. It wasn't just to give you a rundown of the scramble, but rather because this is, of course, how Christianity was introduced to large parts of the continent. So prior to colonization, Africa had been split between Islam and traditional African paganism, with North Africa and the Sahel being Muslim, as well as most of the Horn of Africa and some parts of East Africa too. But the rest of the continent, with very few exceptions, remained pagan, and this allowed missionaries to convert millions of people. As you can imagine, not everyone welcomes these foreigners with open arms, and most of them didn't really care about the theology stuff, but they were receptive to the medical and educational services that the missionaries offered. And this was really what helped spread Christianity across the continent. Now, as you can imagine, the missionaries that different countries sent depended on the majority religion, with the French, Belgians, and Portuguese sending Catholic missionaries and the British and Germans sending Protestant ones. Now, the colonies did not all convert to the denomination or even the religion of the colonizer, since European states had been secularized to various rates, and therefore you could find Catholic missionaries in Protestant countries and vice versa. Also, all Christian missionaries basically completely failed to convert the pre-existing Muslim population, and that has not really changed much ever since. Now, a similar dynamic occurred across Oceania, which was also experiencing colonization by the same powers at the same time, and that is why most of Oceania is also Christian to this day. So anyways, let's check in on the chat again, see how things are going. I claim the entire African continent for myself. I claim a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. It has to be kosher pork sausage. This is very nice and wholesome, chat. I like this. So, who's this guy over here? This is Pope Leo XIII. We mentioned him a couple of times, so let's see what he wanted to do. Well, he was really interested in advancing Christian science and worked to revive Thomism, or in other words, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, as Christian philosophy, and encouraged the study of history and archaeology. Now, in order to facilitate this, he opened the Vatican Archives in 1881 for researchers, and a decade later created the Vatican Observatory. Now, he believed that the only way to combat rationalists who undermined church authority was to have trained Catholic experts, so in 1893, he issued an encyclical allowing critical methods to be used in studying the Bible. He instituted the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1902 to adapt Catholic biblical studies to modern audience and scholarship and protect Scripture from attacks. Now, he's also influenced by German Bishop Wilhelm Emanuel von Ketteler, and he published an encyclical named Rerum Novarum in 1891, which translates to On Capital and Labor in its full form. This was a response to the social instability that had risen from labor conflict during the Industrial Revolution. And this explained Catholic social teaching, which rejected socialism, but also rejected unethical capitalist exploitation. He taught that the government's role was to promote social justice through the protection of rights, but this also included property rights. It proposed the formation of trade unions and the introduction of collective bargaining as an alternative to state intervention, and recognized that the poor have a special status in the consideration of social issues. Now, Louis Duchesne was a French priest who taught church history at the Catholic University of Paris and applied modern methods to church history by using archaeology to supplement literature. Now, he became very popular for demythologizing popular pious lives of saints, but his history of the early church was considered too modern, and he was therefore banned by the Catholic Church in 1912. Now, one of his students, Alfred Loisy, was another priest and theologian from France who became known as the father of Catholic modernism. He made many controversial statements, such as that Moses did not actually write the first 5 chapters of the Bible, or first 5 books of the Bible, that the first 5 chapters of the Bible were not historical. The Old Testament was generally historically unreliable, and therefore the Bible was basically just another ancient book. He also began to see Christianity more as a system of ethics. Again, this is what every liberal Christian does, instead of revelation from God, and so he was also excommunicated in 1908. Now, the new Pope, Pius X, issued an encyclical in 1907 condemning modernism for embracing basically every heresy. It was described as opposing scholastic philosophy and resisting the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, it called for the promotion of scholastic philosophy in seminaries, for the removal of suspected modernist professors, for more censorship of publications, and the creation of an anti-modernist group in every Catholic diocese. Now, Pope Pius frequently condemned modernists and was concerned that they would see themselves as true Catholics while misinterpreting Catholic beliefs, so he introduced an anti-modernist oath that all priests had to take in 1912 or 1910. Now, a priest named Umberto Benigni even organized a secret network of spies to monitor the activities of suspected modernists. But it was so zealous and so sneaky that actually ended up undermining the traditionalists in their position. And this is Pope Pius X. Actually has a lot of aura now that I think about it, or maybe he's just really good at posing for the camera. And then this is Umberto Benigni, not so cool. He was the guy leading all the spies against the modernists. Now, just if you think it couldn't get worse for the Catholic Church, of course, France once again comes into it. Has anyone noticed it's like always France and Germany every single time? So in 1899, the French government fought with the popes over the appointment of bishops and chaplains who were removed from naval and military hospitals in 1903. Then, soldiers were banned from attending Catholic clubs the following year. Now, Prime Minister Émile Combes was determined to completely defeat Catholicism and closed all Catholic schools in France, and then rejected the authorization of all religious orders, and 20,000 people were forced to leave the country. Now, this finally led to Catholicism being removed as a state religion of France in 1905, and all church property was confiscated, which makes that, I think, now the 3rd time in French history that they've done this. Now, this caused the Catholic Church in France to lose half of its priests, but also allowed it to act finally independently of government control. And so here is a picture showing basically France getting a divorce with the Catholic Church. Now, one major liberal Christian was a German theologian named David Strauss, who wrote a Life of Jesus, in which he used a mythical interpretation of the Gospels to undermine their historical accuracy. Now, this book helped further weaken church authority and challenge the idea that Jesus was God. In 1900, another German theologian named Adolf von Hornack published The Essence of Christianity, in which he basically described Jesus as just being a reformer. And then yet another German theologian named William Rede rejected all the theological aspects of Jesus altogether. Now, there was one good German Protestant theologian of the time named Albert Schweitzer, who wrote The Quest for the Historical Jesus in 1910. He critiqued the various books on Jesus' life that had been written in the last few decades as reflecting the lives of the authors more than that of Jesus, and trying to look further into the historical Jesus was more of a pointless endeavor because everything we knew about him basically does come from the Bible. So, as a response to this, we saw the beginning of Christian fundamentalism. It traced its origins to the Niagara Bible Conference in 1878, led by James Hall Brooks, this guy, a Presbyterian minister from St. Louis, Missouri. Now, this introduced to many American Protestants the idea of premillennialism, or the idea that belief that Jesus will return to the earth and begin his 1,000-year reign, which, as I mentioned many times, that happened yesterday. Jesus came back. I guess I wasn't raptured, unfortunately. Now, this tied in with the idea of dispensationalism, which believes that history is divided into multiple ages in which God interacts with his chosen people during those ages. Now, those Christian fundamentalists tended to also be Zionists and supported the restoration of the state of Israel, which I'm sure is definitely not going to be controversial at any point during the future. Now, they also believed that the Bible had no mistakes and believed that the rapture would happen before Jesus' return. Now, they soon split with the modernists, who believed that they were sending people to hell, while neo-evangelicals were basically like a middle ground between the two positions. Now, fundamentalists believed that you had to believe in certain fundamental beliefs, such as the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement, or that Jesus died as a sacrifice for your sins, Jesus' resurrection, and that he's coming again. They also incorporated certain specifically Protestant beliefs, such as sola scriptura and biblical infallibility. Those who were the most hardcore about these beliefs kept the fundamentalist names, while those who were a little more chill called themselves evangelicals. Now, on the very last day of the 19th century, December 31st, 1899, American Methodist preacher Charles Fox Parham began preaching about the baptism of the Holy Spirit and laid hands on a woman named Agnes Osman, who began preaching in tongues and prophesying. One of his followers was William J. Seymour, an African-American pastor who, like Parham, believed that baptism with the Holy Spirit was the third work of grace after being born again and entire sanctification. In 1906, Seymour moved to Los Angeles and began preaching that speaking in tongues was the first evidence of being filled with the Holy Spirit. His followers formed a group that would get together regularly and pray to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Soon the crowds grew large and were full of people shouting, singing, moaning, and speaking in tongues. For those of you who don't know, speaking in tongues essentially kind of means speaking in another language thanks to divine intervention. And this is William J. Seymour over here. Now his congregation soon moved to Azusa Street and began a revival attended not just by holiness Christians, but also Baptists, Mennonites, Quakers, and Presbyterians. Soon diseases were being cured, the blind began to see, and immigrants who couldn't even speak English were understanding uneducated black attendees who were speaking to them in their native language. Visitors would come and give their testimony, and there were prayers in tongues for the sick, for missionaries, and for whoever wanted prayer. There was often spontaneous preaching and calls for salvation, sanctification, and baptism for the Holy Spirit. Now, although only around 50 to 60 people visited regularly, thousands would visit or stay temporarily. Charles Parham, who had discipled Seymour, soon came to visit, but was really disgusted by the fact that black and white Americans were actually worshiping together, because, the absolute horror of seeing that, Jesus would not approve. And anyway, here is kind of a bit of compilation of, some of the pictures and newspapers of the time. Now, although some members left with Parham, the movement continued strongly and became known as the Pentecostal Church. The first Pentecostal missionaries were soon sent abroad, and already by 1909 there were some missionaries serving in British Bechuanaland, now Botswana. Alfred Goodrich Garr went to India and China and influenced the movement by changing the belief that speaking in tongues was for evangelism to the idea that it was a gift for spiritual empowerment. But maybe the reason he made that change is because when he went to India and China, no one could understand what he was saying. Now, within just 2 years of the Azusa Street revival, Pentecostalism has spread to over 50 countries on every continent. Most holiness denominations adopted Pentecostalism and has since become the fastest growing Christian denomination in the world. Now, the early 20th century saw the rise of another major movement known as ecumenism, the idea that Christians of all denominations should work together to promote unity. Now, the first to use this word was Count von Zinzendorf, who tried to unite all Christian denominations into a Church of God in the Spirit back in the 18th century. Another big milestone was the founding of the London Missionary Society in 1795 by various evangelical denominations. However, the modern movement began with the work of Nathan Soderblom, the Archbishop of Uppsala and the head of the Lutheran Church of Sweden. During World War I, he called on Christian leaders to work for peace and justice. He hosted the 1925 Stockholm Conference, where Protestant and Orthodox Christians from different denominations were all participating, but the Catholic Church did not attend. And finally, we got to modern Christianity, the final century. Now, before we continue, I'm going to take a quick break to drink some water. My throat hurts a lot. But in the meantime, let's check in on the chat, see how it's going. Welcome, Ionarchist. Good to see you here. Speaking in tongues is retarded. Now this I wasn't aware. Welcome, Sir Welch. Nice to see you. How are you doing? All you gotta do is shout. Yeah, no, I know that. I grew up like Pentecostal. You're right. You can just make that stuff up so easily. There's like no actual foundation to it. Oh, how long have I been streaming? Dang, bro, 80 minutes, and we only did 1 century, guys. Sorry. Anyways, I hope we're done within 65 minutes because I have to eat dinner. Anyways, nice to see you two GigaChads here. We'll continue still. Oh, man. Guys, my throat hurts so bad. But you know what? We're doing this for the love of the game. We're finishing the stream tonight, and then we'll finally start uploading this stuff on YouTube very, very, very soon. All right. Let's do this, guys. Final century. Here we go. So by 1914, Christianity had reached its peak. For the very first time in history, it could be considered a truly global religion, being almost totally dominant in North America, South America, and Oceania, nearly dominant in Europe, and having a large presence in Africa and some presence in Asia too. Now, Protestantism had gone through 3 great awakenings, leading to the birth and or expansion of Baptists, Methodism, Evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, as well as some non-Protestant groups such as Adventists and Mormons. Catholicism had lost nearly all of its political power, but with that it could focus more on a spiritual mission, and it continued spreading around the globe. Orthodoxy was now in a better state with the decline of Ottoman power, led by the powerful and expanding Russian Empire. And with the scramble for Africa over, nearly the entire world was now under European and therefore some form of Christian control. And so now let's look at the Christianity in 1914, which let's remember was only 11 decades ago. So we can see, of course, Scandinavia is very religious. The Lutherans now are basically just confined to northern and eastern Germany, as well as some Lutheran immigrants here in the United States. We have the Anglicans, who again still scattered across England and Wales, but easily form a majority in both Australia and New Zealand, and some parts of northern Canada as well. Hussites, once again, just chilling in Bohemia. Same with the Nestorians in Assyria. The Oriental Orthodox have not spread that much, still some in Armenia and Ethiopia, as well as a few in Egypt and Nubia. And the Orthodox, of course, the Balkans and Russia, kind of been that way for quite a while now. As for the Reformed, again, majority in Scotland, some parts in England, some in Switzerland, some in Hungary and Poland. There's some now in Indonesia as well, South Africa, Guyana. Now, meanwhile, we also see, of course, the Southern Baptists here in the South. And the Catholics are spread all over the world: Ireland, Iberia, France, Italy, Austria, Poland, Lithuania, Philippines. They have now spread also to certain parts of Southern and Central Africa, such as Uganda, Rwanda, the Congo, Angola, Mozambique. Of course, nearly all of South America, nearly all of Central America, nearly all of the Caribbean, large parts of Canada. So the Catholics really are on quite a roll. And then the nonconformist Protestants have really spread quite a bit. So we can see, of course, northern United States, most of Canada, Alaska, and of course, most of the Christians in Africa at this point would be nonconformist Protestants in places such as Kenya, Tanzania, DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, etc. So, of course, in 1914, as we all know, is the outbreak of World War I. One shot would change the fate of humanity, and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne by Serb nationalists, would escalate into the First World War, which would change the world forever. Of course, Austria declared war on Serbia, which resulted in Serbia's ally Russia declaring war on Austria. Austria's ally Germany then declared war on Russia, and soon after went to war with France, Belgium, and its ally the United Kingdom. Now, taking advantage of this war, the greatly weakened Ottoman Sultanate declared war on Russia, hoping that it could win and take back some land. But the Ottomans, as Muslims, soon became suspicious that their Christian population would side with the Christian Russians, and became particularly suspicious of the Armenians. Now, the Armenians lived in the Caucasus, an area being invaded by the Russians. So as a response to this, the Ottoman government organized the Armenian Genocide, which saw between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians killed during death marches to the Syrian desert, and those who survived were forced to convert to Islam, mostly women and children. But if you thought one genocide was enough, think again, because the Ottomans also initiated the Sifo, a genocide of the Syrian Nestorian Christians, in which about 250,000 of them were murdered. But in case you thought two genocides weren't enough, you're still wrong, because the Ottomans committed another genocide against the Greeks who went to war with them in 1917. It included your typical massacres, forced deportations, death marches throughout the Syrian desert, as well as expulsions and executions. And by the end in 1923, between 300,000 and 900,000 people had died. And so what that means is that in total, basically up to 2 million Christians were killed by the Ottomans in the span of just 10 years. Here's a picture of the Armenian genocide going on death marches in the desert. So as you can imagine, Middle Eastern Christianity changed a lot after World War I. The religious demographics of the now former Ottoman Sultanate was transformed, and even though the Ottomans lost World War I, what little territory they had left was split by the British and the French, but Turkey managed to hold on thanks to Mustafa Kemal, who then turned it into a republic. Now, the new Turkey would be very Muslim, and it had basically no Armenians or Greeks left. And as for Assyrians, their community was basically been extinguished, and so this was essentially the end of the Nestorian Church, the oldest individual denomination still in existence. Now, this isn't to say they don't exist, but geographically they now form the majority nowhere. However, there was one positive, which was that Jerusalem was under Christian control for the first time in 730 years when the British captured it from the Ottomans, and it would become the center for the new Mandate of Palestine. And here are the British entering Jerusalem. And so we can see the Christianity in 1923, and yet even though this is just 9 years later, things have already changed quite a lot. Now you'll notice Nestorians are no longer here, right? They were always here. They'd been chilling here for literally a millennium at least. And of course the Nestorian Church itself was quite a bit older, but now we can see Nestorians are officially off our map. We can also see, of course, that the Armenian community has been greatly reduced to just the area around here. The Greeks also not much of a presence. Even this tiny presence will be removed quite soon. But we can also see things changing over here in Russia, where suddenly large parts of it are no longer Orthodox. So what's going on there? Well, let's look at how Russia was doing during the war. Well, the war went awfully for them, and by mid-1915, the army was running short of guns and ammunition, and some soldiers were sent to the front without any weapons. Desertion, fleeing, and looting were common in what became known as the Great Retreat of 1915. Now, Russia's poor military performance caused many people to complain against Emperor Nicholas II, who took personal control of the army in 1915. Now, while he commanded the front, his German wife ruled back home and was criticized for her relationship with this weirdo called Grigory Rasputin. Now, Rasputin's influence led to disastrous appointments and corruption, and this only worsened Russia's situation. Now, in order to finance the war, the government printed millions of rubles, which caused inflation to quadruple by 1917. This caused the farmers to then hoard their grain, and therefore there were food shortages in the cities. And this is Nicholas II. And while he got blamed for a lot. Now, living conditions in the cities were awful, with an average of 16 people living in apartments, all without any running water and constant threat of disease. This resulted in more criticism of the government, strikes, and the increased participation of workers in revolutionary parties, including, of course, the Communist Party. Now, Nicholas was blamed for all these crises, and what little support he had, especially among the nobles, disappeared, mainly because of his association with Rasputin. By late October 1916, nearly 2 million soldiers had been killed, 2 million captured, and 1 million were just missing. The parliament warned him that a terrible disaster would grip the country unless he set up a constitutional government. They eventually lost confidence in Emperor Nicholas, and Rasputin was assassinated by the nobles in December 1916. And some of them even began considering a coup against Nicholas in early 1917. In early February 1917, workers in Petrograd began several strikes, and on the 7th of March, they closed down the largest industrial plant in the city. The next day, a series of rallies were held for International Women's Day, and demonstrations were organized to demand bread. Now, the female and male workers united, and this shut down nearly every factory in Petrograd. Now, Nicholas II decided to solve this problem by sending in the army, but even the 12,000 soldiers loyal to him did not really want to shoot women. And so on the 11th of March, when they were ordered to fire on the crowd, most of them just refused. Now this led to chaos across the city as governmental authority collapsed, especially as Nicholas dismissed the parliament. Now the socialists took advantage of this chaos to establish the Petrograd Soviet to represent workers and soldiers. And so here is a picture of the February Revolution. So Nicholas knew that he had to act, and he took a train back to Petrograd, but he was stopped on the 14th of March by a group of revolutionaries. He was then advised by the army chief and parliament representatives to resign, which he did the next day. He tried to abdicate in favor of his brother, but he refused, and soon Nicholas was placed under house arrest. Now Russia would become a republic, and a government was set up led by a liberal aristocrat, Georgy Lvov, who became the prime minister. However, the socialists refused to accept his authority and set up the Petrograd Soviet as a rival government. The Soviet leadership refused to participate in the provisional government, but one socialist called Alexander Kerensky eventually joined the new cabinet and eventually became the prime minister. He released thousands of prisoners and promoted freedom of speech, but he also continued the war and started an unsuccessful offensive. Now, this would all collapse because of one train sent by the Germans, which contained a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, who was there to lead a communist revolution. The Germans were hoping Lenin would further destabilize Russia and eventually withdraw it from the war. Now, he arrived in Petrograd in April 1917 and came to lead the Bolshevik Party. He very much was against any cooperation with the Russian government, even though most Bolsheviks were actually fine with it. After his arrival, their support increased, especially as the Kerensky offensive failed in June. Now, many soldiers refused to follow orders to continue fighting, and soldiers and sailors, along with Petrograd workers, began violent street protests. This was not supported by Lenin and soon failed. Lenin fled to Finland, while his associate Leon Trotsky was arrested. Now, the July days, as this came to become known, showed how popular Bolsheviks were, but also showed how unprepared they were for a revolution. Now, between February and September, though, the Bolsheviks grew from 24 to 200,000, and now were the majority socialist faction in Moscow and Petrograd. In August, General Lavr Kornilov believed that they had taken over the government and ordered his troops to march on Petrograd and capture the city. Kerensky freaked out and asked the Petrograd Soviet and Bolsheviks for help. This worked, and the socialist control over the railroad workers helped establish or stop the movement of Kornilov's troops, which helped establish the Bolsheviks in a stronger position. Now, in early September, the Petrograd Soviet freed all jailed Bolsheviks, and Trotsky became the Petrograd Soviet's chairman. The Bolsheviks' reputation as the only organized opposition party that had refused to cooperate with the government and the disgust with other parties greatly benefited their cause. By October, Lenin felt that it was safe enough to return to Petrograd, where he believed he would have a second chance to start a revolution. He recognized how much power the Bolsheviks had and began planning for an immediate coup. This was known as the October Revolution, even though it started on the 7th of November. Now, Lenin bravely led the revolution by hiding while his soldiers led an assault on Petrograd and captured the city. But in case you think that this finally settled the violence, you are very, very wrong. Now, although Lenin was hiding in real life, he did make this epic propaganda poster to make himself look a lot cooler than he actually was. Now, liberal and monarchist forces loosely organized into the White Army, while the new Bolshevik government's army was known as the Red Army, and this was the beginning of the Russian Civil War. Now remember that while all this chaos was going on, World War I was still raging, and Russia was still supposed to be on the Allied side. But as you can imagine, the Allies were not big fans of the first communist government in the world, and they began supplying the White Army with weapons and ammunition. And although Lenin led the Bolshevik Party, it has been argued that since he did not participate in the coup, it was really Trotsky and his organization and leadership that led the revolution. Now, elections took place on the 25th of November, but the Bolsheviks only won a quarter of the vote and had very little support outside of Petrograd and Moscow. So then they just basically banned all the non-Bolsheviks from the Soviets and then just got rid of parliament altogether. And here we have this guy. Many of you will know who he is. Lenin and I believe Kamenev, although I'm not exactly sure. Maybe Zinoviev. Anyway, some of the main architects of what became known as the Red Terror. Now, during the revolution, the Bolsheviks set up revolutionary tribunals to combat counter-revolutionaries at their civil war's peak, with over 200,000 of them being investigated by around 200 tribunals. Now, these tribunals were quite efficient and usually only took a few months to sentence someone, but part of that was because there was no concrete definition of what a counter-revolutionary even was. Of course, the most famous person executed by the Bolsheviks was Nicholas II, who was moved east to Yekaterinburg in order to not be captured or freed by the whites. During the early morning of the 16th of July, Nicholas, his wife, his children, their physician, and several servants were taken into the basement and shot dead. And so here is the assassination of the Russian royal family. Now, obviously, I did not include all of this information unless it affected Christianity, which of course it had a massive impact on. Now, since the 18th century, the Russian Orthodox Church had been run by the most holy synod of bishops who were appointed by the emperor. Now, you can imagine that after he got overthrown, he sided with a white movement, which only made the Bolsheviks hate the church even more. And it's not as if they were liked by them previously, because Lenin believed that the communist regime could not be neutral towards religion, but had to actively fight against it. As such, he imprisoned or killed many clergy and other Christians. Criticism of atheism was banned and could lead to imprisonment. Ironically, for a country that hated the state church so much, the Soviet Union ended up being the first state atheist country. Now, the Soviet Union was the first state whose goal was to completely eliminate religion. So it ridiculed religion, harassed believers, propagated atheism in school, and confiscated church property. Many Eastern Orthodox priests were sent to prison or labor camps, tortured or executed, and just between 1917 and 22, when the Soviet Union was proclaimed, 28 bishops and 1,200 priests were executed. Nearly the entire clergy were shot or sent to labor camps. Theological schools were closed and church publications were banned. Between 1927 and 40, the number of Eastern Orthodox churches decreased and fell from 30,000 to less than 500, while between 1917 and 1940, 130,000 Orthodox priests were arrested and 95,000 were shot. And here is a picture of Lenin proudly standing with the Soviet flag and the priests being sent to work in the gulags. Now, the persecution did not end after the Russian Civil War ended in 1923, and it continued well into the 1930s. Soviet persecution of Christians was the most effective in history, and the church all but collapsed by the 1930s, with most people becoming irreligious. The charitable and social work done by the church was now taken over by the state, and as with all private property, all church property was therefore confiscated, and the church could no longer educate children. Instructing the young and evangelism was forbidden, and the only form of Christian teaching allowed was during sermons. Catechism, religious schools, study groups, and Sunday schools were all made illegal. Now, there was little good news for the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union, but it was experiencing a revival in other countries such as Greece, where the Zoe movement was taking shape in 1911, a nationwide Sunday school movement that reached 150,000 students, but also included organizations for professional men, youth, parents, and young nurses. They circulated Bibles, novels, pamphlets, and other religious materials. They also built seminaries because in 1920, only 800 out of Greece's 4,500 priests had anything more than an elementary school education. Now, during the chaos of the Russian Revolution, the Finnish Orthodox Church declared its autonomy from the Russian one and completely separated by 1923. Meanwhile, in 1922, the First Orthodox Congress of Albania met and created a separate Albanian Orthodox Church. And so now we get to Christianity just 10 years later in 1933. We can see that Orthodoxy has basically all but collapsed across the Soviet Union. Now, large parts of Ukraine still remained religious, as well as some parts of Russia, but for the most part, Eastern Orthodoxy was dying out. Now, return to World War I. Despite a very impressive effort and Russia's collapse, Germany eventually lost the war in 1918, mainly due to attrition and the USA entering the war on the Allied side. Germany was forced to return Alsace-Lorraine to France, Schleswig to Denmark, give up all of its colonies, and split its eastern land to create a sea corridor for the newly independent Poland. It also had to reduce its army to 100,000 and pay heavy reparations. Now, you can imagine that the Treaty of Versailles was therefore not very popular in Germany, which would soon experience hyperinflation. Eventually, Germany began to recover its strength, and its new liberal Republican government was starting to gain support. However, this all changed in 1929 when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. Boom. All right. Before we get to the next part, let's just check in on the chat, see how it's going. Soviet Union is a stain on the human race. I agree. Okay, now we have 3 people watching. That's kind of sick. Maker, you need to mention the fact that Ottomans kidnapped children and brainwashed them. I did. I did mention that when I was talking about the fall of Constantinople. That's such a Sir Welch way of saying it. It was a rather unseemly entity. So, of course, we all know who that is. In this situation, a certain failed artist rose to power, promising to make Germany great again, break the shackles of Versailles, restore the economy, and make Germany feared and respected in the world once more. He blamed socialists, capitalists, and the Allied power for Germany's situation, but most importantly were the enemies within, the Jews. Now, obviously, this man needs no introduction, and the Great Depression fueled Adolf Hitler's rise to power as Führer in 1933. Although Hitler had been raised Catholic, Nazi support came almost exclusively from Protestants who voted them into power. Most Protestant church leaders supported the Nazis' anti-Jewish measures. In 1937, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical that warned Catholics that anti-Semitism is incompatible with Christianity and declared Hitler was an insane and arrogant prophet. He criticized the Nazis for putting the nation above God and human rights and declared that Christians are all spiritual Semites, which led Hitler to then call him the chief Christian rabbi. Now, although Pius XI was strongly critical of Nazism, he issued another encyclical in 1937 defining communism as the main adversary of the Catholic Church. The persecution of the Church in the Soviet Union played a larger role in this, but also the ongoing Spanish Civil War, which had started in 1936. Spain was divided between the Republican government and its leftist coalition of socialists, anarchists, and communists, against rebel nationalist forces being led by Francisco Franco and his fascist and conservative allies. Now, during this war, there was widespread anti-clericalism, and the Republican forces destroyed thousands of churches, and 13 bishops and 6,382 clergy and other Catholic faithful were executed. Now, despite this widespread persecution, it was barely covered in the media, and little was done to prevent it. So here's Francisco Franco, who was the nationalist leader and would eventually win the Spanish Civil War. And of course, now we get to World War I, the sequel, World War II. Now, Europe was growing darker and darker and heading inevitably towards another world war. Germany began breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, remilitarizing the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, rearming and rebuilding its military, annexing Austria in 1938, and invading Czechoslovakia in 1939. Now, that year, Germany signed the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, which divided up Eastern Europe and most notably Poland, which stood in the middle, making this the 4th time the Russians and Germans carved up Poland, and as of the time of recording, well, Poland's being attacked for a 5th time now by the Russians. Now, Germany invaded on the 1st of September, marking the start of World War II, but the Soviets didn't want to miss out on the party and began their own invasion on the 17th of September. Now, throughout 1940, Germany overran Europe, conquering Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, before invading Greece and Yugoslavia in 1941 because Italy, once again, was being a totally useless ally. Now, unsurprisingly, Hitler was not good at keeping any of his promises and basically invaded the Soviet Union anyway that summer, leading to the creation of the Eastern Front, which would become the bloodiest theater of combat in all of human history. Now, throughout this time, despite having many enemies, Hitler still considered the Jews his main enemy and worked to have them exterminated, leading to the start of the Holocaust in 1941. The church was not spared, and soon many monks were persecuted for being homosexual, which was a crime that would send you to a concentration camp. Now, one major resistance group developed around Austrian priest Heinrich Meyer, whose groups passed on plans for V-2 rockets, Tiger tanks, and aircraft to the Allies. From the fall of 1943, these transmissions informed the Allies about the exact sites of German production factories and also informed them early on about the mass murder of Jews. 706 Austrian Catholic priests were imprisoned by the Nazis, and between 20 and 90 of them were murdered in concentration camps. In Poland, the Nazis murdered over 2,500 monks and priests and sent many more to concentration camps, with Dachau having 2,600 priests alone. Now, many Catholics helped shelter Jews during the Holocaust, and the head rabbi of Rome even became a Catholic after the war ended. The Catholic Church, in fact, saved more Jews in the Holocaust than all other churches and organizations put together. And of course, we've all seen these pictures of the concentration camps, and this is Pope Pius. But the Catholic Church was not completely innocent of the Holocaust either. After Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis, Croatia became an independent state and named itself the Independent State of Croatia. It was anti-communist and was committed to reinstating Catholic influence in the region. Although the church never recognized it, the Pope was a supporter of Croat nationalism. He was also aware of their genocide against Eastern Orthodox Serbs and other minorities, and of course this included Jews too. Now, the Catholic Church never publicly called it out, but instead applied diplomatic pressure, although it seems that they mostly supported the regime. Many of the regime's war criminals then escaped the consequences of their actions thanks to the Church, with dictator Ante Pavlovich given refuge in the Vatican by Pius XI or XII, and assistance in flying to Argentina. Now, World War II was devastating to everyone involved, and a new world order would be shaped by the victorious Allies after they won in 1945. The big three were the UK, USA, and USSR, but they had very different plans for what Europe should look like after the war. The UK and USA were democracies and wanted to set up liberal capitalist democracies in the liberated territories, while the USSR wanted to set up communist governments instead. Now, neither side could really force the other to implement their desired government, so Europe ended up split in two between capitalist West and the communist East. Now, one of the few things the Allies did agree on, though, was that Germans were a major problem, and as such they split Germany into 4 occupation zones and deported between 12 and 14 million Germans from the east of the new German borders, which resulted in the destruction of centuries-old Protestant populations, especially in Prussia, which, if you remember, was the very first Protestant country in the entire world. And so here is a map of the expulsion of Germans. Now we get to Christianity in 1947. Now we can see that basically Christianity has almost been completely eliminated from the Soviet Union, but has also basically decreased across the Balkans as they became more secularized, with Greece kind of being the only major Orthodox nation left, along with Georgia. Meanwhile, we can see that atheism was also spreading quite a bit in France, in Austria, in the Czech Republic, and this trend would only continue even more. However, we can see that Christianity was spreading a lot more in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if we learned anything from the Russian Revolution, it was that communists were really not fans of Christians, and their anti-religious policies would continue in the newly communist states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. These countries all adopted state atheism, banned religion, and persecuted Christianity, but they were not equally effective. Some countries like the modern-day Czech Republic, Estonia, and former East Germany are some of the few areas that are not just majority atheism practiced, but even majority atheist in terms of identification. But communism would soon become a global problem after World War II. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended in the victory of Mao Zedong's Red Army. He expelled all foreign missionaries and, in an effort to isolate Chinese Catholics, set up patriotic churches. In the 1960s, the Cultural Revolution encouraged the elimination of all churches in the country. We can see now the spread of communism from the USSR like a cancer to many parts of the world. Now, let's look at Latin America. So, they were the strongest bastion of Catholicism, but even they weren't immune to the tide of anti-Christian feeling. In 1954, Argentina under Juan Perón saw the extensive destruction of churches, denunciation of clergy, and confiscation of schools. He was also trying to extend state control over national institutions. 5 years later, Cuba became the only communist state in the Western Hemisphere after Fidel Castro's guerrillas won the Cuban Revolution. He reduced the Catholic Church's ability to function by deporting the Archbishop and 150 Spanish priests. He also discriminated against Catholics in public life and education, and they were banned from the Communist Party. Now, in the face of the waning influence of Catholicism, many Protestant missionaries have been sent to Latin America, resulting in a growing Protestant presence in the region. So, Christianity found itself in a tough spot in the early 1960s. Communism had effectively destroyed the church in all of Eastern Europe except for Poland. In the Western world, secularism was on the rise, a process that had been ongoing since the Enlightenment. By 1962, France had basically become irreligious, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Atheism was also taking hold in Canada, especially in British Columbia. However, Christianity was beginning to expand more quickly throughout sub-Saharan Africa. In 1900, there were only 9 million Christians in Africa, while 6 decades later, the number had grown to 60 million. And as many African countries gained independence in the 1960s, Christianity stopped being associated with colonialism, which helped the work of foreign missionaries in Africa. And so if we look at Christianity in 1962, we can see it's quickly collapsing. Of course, Catholics retained a strong presence in Iberia, Ireland, Poland, Italy, and parts of Germany, but we can see that's collapsing quite quickly. The Lutherans basically are only left in West Germany, and the British Isles remain still Christian at this time, but things are going to change. Now we can also see that Australia and New Zealand were effectively irreligious, as well as British Columbia. Anyways, let's check the chat, see what's going on over there. Atheism is unfortunate, I agree that. So, the final ecumenical council. In 1962, the last and perhaps most important ecumenical council in Catholic history since the early church was held. It is considered the 21st ecumenical council in Catholic history and will radically change the church. In 1959, Pope John XXIII decided to call an ecumenical council, which came as a surprise to his cardinals. His goals were to create a Catholic renewal, start progress to Christian reunion, and steps to solve major social and economic issues. On Christmas Day 1961, the council was officially summoned and opened on the 11th of October 1962. Many reforms were proposed, including active participation of the congregation, communal singing, a partial replacement of Latin with local languages, communion under both kinds, finally, which is something that the Hussites had advocated for 5 centuries earlier, and the adaptation of liturgy to local customs. Now, this was opposed by conservatives in the church, and the debate lasted 15 days before a vote was held. However, only 46 out of the 2,215 bishops voted against the changes. The council also reasserted the importance of Marian devotion, her perpetual virginity, her role as a mediator, and her central role in redeeming Christians. There were also ecumenical statements saying that Catholics should be involved in ecumenical endeavors and admit that Catholics were partly to blame for previous schisms in church history. Now, by this time, Pope John XXIII had died and was replaced by Pope Paul VI, who stunned the bishops by announcing that he would take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, the first time in literally over 500 years that a pope had even left Italy. So in the first week of 1964, he went on a 3-day pilgrimage where he met Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople, the first time a pope and ecumenical patriarch had met in 6 centuries. If you remember, the last time that they had done so, it was, I believe, the Council of Florence or something like that, where they were trying to reunite the churches. Now, another radical change was when a text on religious freedom was created proclaiming everyone's right to worship freely, a position contrary to the traditional view, which stated that only Catholics were permitted to worship freely. I mean, after all, right, there had been the Inquisition and all that. Now, if all religions were treated equally, then one could imply that all of them are equally true. But the church did not believe this and justified this change on the idea that everyone had the duty to obey their conscience. But this was very harshly criticized by the conservatives. And here we have Pope Paul VI meeting with Patriarch Athenagoras, one of the very big moments in Christian history. Now, another change was the rejection of the idea that the Jews were cursed for having murdered Jesus, and therefore could no longer be discriminated against for that reason. A less controversial change was the statement that lay people had their own task of changing the world and should participate in the royal priesthood of Christ. What was controversial was that these lay people did not always need to be under the supervision of the clergy. In terms of missionary work, the council argued for less control by Rome and greater adaptation to local cultures. It also argued that priestly training should be determined by local bishops instead of Rome directly, and biblical study should be the basis of seminary training. But there were even more controversies. Another controversial statement were the changes made to the position of marriage, such as that love was just as important in marriage as reproduction, that couples could choose the amount of kids they wanted, and there was no explicit condemnation of birth control. Now, before the new changes could be passed, there were obstacles to overcome, and the strongest opposition were on the statements regarding religious freedom, ecumenism, and the Pope's role. The Pope only made things more controversial when he gave Mary a new title of Mother of the Church, which placed her above the Church instead of within the Church. He also celebrated Mass for the first time in the local language, and face the people during the service, something which they had never done, because for all of Catholic history, at least for centuries anyway, the priest had always faced away from the people. Now, on the 4th of December 1965, Pope Paul participated in an ecumenical prayer service with 100 non-Catholics in Rome, the first time a pope had ever prayed with non-Catholics publicly. 2 days later, he gave speeches at St. Peter's, thanking everyone who had taken participation in the council, and they all received golden rings. He urged all Catholics to study and accept the decisions of the Second Vatican Council and apply them to renew themselves spiritually. The next day, a joint declaration with Patriarch Athenagoras was read out, lifting the excommunications of 1054, which had resulted in the Great Schism that had separated their churches, and promised to work towards complete communion between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. The 8th of December was the final day and saw 300,000 people gather in St. Peter's for an outdoor mass to close the council. The Second Vatican Council was a record-breaking council, being the first ecumenical council to be truly ecumenical, with bishops between 250 native African and Asian bishops. It had unprecedented scope and variety of issues discussed, from fundamental theological issues to practical ones, and even topics no council had ever addressed, such as collaboration of the Catholic Church with the secular world and its relationship to non-Christians. It did not actually have any condemnations, as all the previous councils had done, and the information it transmitted spread almost instantly through newspapers, radio, and now the emerging technology of television. And this was easily the most significant event in Catholic history since the Reformation. Now, despite the changes from the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church still faced threats from other developments, such as the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which led Paul VI to write an encyclical named Humanae Vitae, which reaffirmed the Catholic Church's view on sex and marriage and condemned birth control. It reaffirmed the sanctity of life from conception to death and condemned both abortion and euthanasia as murder. The Church's rejection of condoms has provoked criticism, especially in countries with high HIV rates. Feminists, of course, also disagreed with these church teachings and worked with American nuns to get the church to ordain women as priests, something which has never happened. Now, another new threat came from liberation theology, a theological approach that emphasized the liberation of the oppressed and engages in socioeconomic analyses to address inequality. Gustav, a theology of liberation. A 1979 bishops' conference in Mexico declared the Latin American church's preferential treatment of the poor. The following year, Archbishop Oscar Romero became the region's most famous martyr when he was murdered by the government in El Salvador while saying Mass. However, the movement was condemned for being too influenced by communism and was rejected by several popes. In 1948, meanwhile, the Coptic and Ethiopian churches reached an agreement that led to an independent Ethiopian church, and 5 bishops were consecrated by Pope Cyril VI of Alexandria. In 1959, he crowned Basilios as the first patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. However, in 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown, and the state church was disestablished as communists took over the country. The new government, once again predictably, began nationalizing church property. The new patriarch Theophilos was arrested in 1976 and executed 3 years later. The government then ordered the church to elect a new patriarch, Takla Haimanot. The Coptic Church refused to recognize the new patriarch because he was installed by communists. He was succeeded by Mercurios in 1988, but after the communist government collapsed in 1991, he was pressured to resign and was replaced by Paulos. And, well, this is sort of a metaphor for the end of the Cold War more generally. In 1991, communism did not just collapse in Ethiopia, but globally, as the Soviet Union fell on Christmas, a very fitting day for the first state atheist country. This once again opened up Eastern Europe to Christianity, but communism had dealt irreparable damage to the faith, and only Poland at this point was still majority Christian. However, even in the Free West, Christianity had not fared much better, with only Spain, Italy, and Ireland retaining large Catholic populations, and Canada had become mostly irreligious by this time as well. Although they would not have a very large impact, missionaries were able now to preach in the former communist bloc, which led to a small church revival. Now, understanding the need for closer church cooperation in this time, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches grew closer, and in 1995, Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople visited the Vatican for the first time. 4 years later, Pope John Paul II visited Romania, making him the first pope to visit an Eastern Orthodox country since the Great Schism. Christianity was also growing rapidly outside of the European world, especially in East and Southeast Asia since the 1980s. Christianity had been growing by 10% every year in China since 1979. Now, Pentecostalism is by far the fastest growing denomination, forming a quarter of Christians by 2000. A lot of this growth is in Africa, where Christians now form a slight majority, having almost completely replaced the pagans. And so finally, we get to Christianity today. Now, skipping forward to the present, Christianity is the largest religion in the world, but it's very interesting to compare those who are nominally Christians to those who actually practice their faith. Looking just at nominal Christians, there are around 2.38 billion Christians, or 31.2% of the world's population. Out of the 232 countries and territories, 157 of these are majority Christian, mostly concentrated in Europe, Oceania, the Americas, and sub-Saharan Africa. Ironically, Asia, where Christianity came from, is the least Christian continent due to competition with Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and atheism. And Christians' largest groups are Catholics, followed by Protestants, followed by Eastern Orthodox, followed by Oriental Orthodox, and followed by Restorationists. And so now let's look at what Christianity looks like today. Now again, if we're only going by self-identification, of course we can see that pretty much all of Latin America is Catholic, with small nonconformists in Belize and Nicaragua, and of course some in the Caribbean too, mainly those colonized by the British. We see the Calvinists are the majority in Guyana and Suriname. We see that the Baptists are still the majority in the south of the U.S. Pretty much the rest of the U.S. is nonconformist. Large parts of Canada as well, southern Ontario, Newfoundland. We see Catholics as well here in the northeast of the U.S., Quebec, large parts of eastern Ontario, and some parts of the north of the country as well. And moving on to the other side, Australia is pretty much all Anglican, as is New Zealand. You can see that parts of eastern Indonesia are mainly Calvinist, with the rest of Oceania often being nonconformist. The Philippines are, of course, very Catholic. There are some nonconformists over here in India. Most of Western Ethiopia remains Oriental Orthodox, as does Armenia. We can see that South Africa has a very large Calvinist population, but the rest of Africa that is Christian tends to be nonconformist, although there are still, of course, large amounts of Catholics in Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique, Angola, DRC, Gabon, Congo, etc. Now, as for Europe, of course, the Balkans, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia remain Eastern Orthodox. Scandinavia and Northern Germany are Protestant, specifically Lutheran. See Scotland, parts of Switzerland, parts of the Netherlands, even parts of Slovakia remain Calvinist. England is still mixed again between the Anglicans, the Calvinists, and nonconformists. Ireland remains very Catholic, and of course the Catholics still remain the largest group in Europe. We can see even nominally, though, of course, the Czechs and the Estonians remain irreligious. However, when you compare that to what Christianity actually looks like today, well, it's a lot more depressing. We can see that basically Canada is essentially irreligious, as is Australia and New Zealand. Pretty much all of Europe at this point is no longer Christian, with very small amount of Orthodox left in Russia. Poland is still majority Catholic, but other than them, you basically have a tiny Catholic population in the Netherlands and Germany, and then of course southern Italy. But that's basically it. However, the US and some parts of Quebec still remain decently Christian. We can also see secularism has spread to the south of South America, so that essentially southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay are effectively irreligious at this point. But nevertheless, we can see that sub-Saharan Africa, most of Latin America, the United States, the Philippines, etc., are majority Christian to this day. And so that is it, everyone. Thank you so much for having come and listened this far. I mean, it's been 2 hours. That's kind of crazy. Now let's just look at some of the major denominations, and then we will officially end the stream. So, major early denominations. The Arians. They split with the Nicenes in 325 because Arius believed that the Father created the Son, and was definitely much more Germanic influence. The Nestorians. They split from the Nicenes in 431 because Nestorius believed that Jesus' human and divine natures were distinct, so Mary was not the mother of God. This was more Iranian influenced. Oriental Orthodox, they split with the Chalcedonians in 451 because Pope Dioscorus I of Alexandria believed that Jesus had one nature and not two, and was more African influenced. The Roman Catholics split with the Eastern Orthodox in 1054 over clerical celibacy, the filioque, and papal primacy, more Latin influenced. The Eastern Orthodox split with the Roman Catholics in 1054 for denying the filioque and papal primacy and are more Greek influenced. The Cathars split from the Roman Catholics in 1143 because they believed in a good New Testament God and an evil Old Testament God. They also rejected everything fleshly, church hierarchy, and the Trinity, and were more Occitan influenced. Now, as for the Reformation, first you got the Hussites. They split from the Roman Catholics in 1412 because Jan Hus believed in communion under both kinds, rejected papal authority, and believed that the Bible should be in the vernacular and is more Czech influenced. The Lutherans split from the Roman Catholics in 1517 because Martin Luther believed in salvation by faith alone, two sacraments, the priesthood of all believers, scripture alone as the basis of doctrine, communion under both kinds, that the Bible should be in vernacular, and rejected papal authority. And this is more German influence. The Zwinglians split from the Roman Catholics in 1522 because Huldrych Zwingli rejected transubstantiation, real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and the use of church art, and is more Swiss influence. The Anabaptists split from the Zwinglians in 1525 because Konrad Grebel and George Blaurock rejected infant baptism, holding public office, war, and state support of the church, and this is more German influenced. The Anglicans split from the Roman Catholics in 1534 because Henry VIII wanted a divorce. They rejected papal authority in favor of royal authority and believed that the Bible should be in the vernacular, and it's more English influenced. Calvinists evolved from the Zwinglians in 1536 due to John Calvin, who believed in utter depravity, double predestination, and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and this is more French influenced. Now, as to the major evangelical denomination, the Baptists split from the Anglicans in 1609 because John Smith believed in believers' baptism through complete immersion, and this is more Southern American influenced. The Methodists split from the Anglicans in 1738 because John Wesley believed in entire sanctification and the necessity to be born again, and this is more English influenced. And meanwhile, the Pentecostals split from the Methodists in 1900 because Charles Fox Parham and William J. Seymour believed in a separate baptism of the Holy Spirit that would lead to speaking in tongues, and this is more American influenced. And for the Restorationist denominations, well, the Mormons split from the Protestants in 1820 because Joseph Smith believed that Jesus went to America, that he was there to restore true Christianity, that polygamy was okay, that the dead could be baptized, and that Mormons should believe in the Bible as well as the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. He also believed that humans are God's spirit children and rejected the Trinity. And this is, of course, more American influenced. The Adventists split from the Baptists in 1844 because William Miller failed to predict Jesus' return, and most of them rejected Sunday worship, and this is more American influenced. The Jehovah's Witnesses also split from Adventists in 1881 because Charles Taze Russell failed to predict Jesus' return and the rapture. They rejected hell and the Trinity and used their own Bible translation and are more American influenced. And finally, we got my totally unbiased tier list. S tier, we have the Lutherans and the Hussites, maybe because I'm a Lutheran, who knows. A tier, we have the Reformed or Calvinists and the Anglicans. B tier, we have the Anabaptists and the Baptists. C tier, we have the Methodists and the Pentecostals. D tier, we have the Nestorians, Oriental Orthodox, and Eastern Orthodox. And F tier, we have the Catholics. And yeah, in case you're wondering, the Restorationists, the Arians, these guys aren't even considered in the tier list. They're not even there. And guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. This was freaking 727 slides. Kind of insane, but I am glad to everyone who made it through. Shout out in particular to World Builders Ministry who watched the entire thing from beginning to end. This was very fun. I hope you learned something new about Christianity. I indeed made all the maps. I have a map for pretty much every single year in Christian history, so if you're ever interested, let me know. And hopefully, you learn a little more about the history of the world's most important, largest, and influential religion. Thank you. Anyways, guys, my throat's hella sore. So I will end the live stream now. And yeah, this will be coming on YouTube as a series of videos. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, peace out. God bless. Christ is King.